I guess modern economics as a scientific doctrine begins with Cantillon, Richard Cantillon, who's a very interesting character too, and I really love Cantillon, who's hardly talked about. But to put in a plug for myself, the Journal of Libertarian Studies, the current issue, now out, is an old Cantillon issue. About the most stuff that's ever been written on Cantillon. It came out of a conference on Cantillon several years ago. Cantillon has essentially the praxeological methodology. He's got the methodology of abstract reasoning. He starts off with a rule of one landlord. In other words, one landlord owns the whole country. Not so far off, because the French situation was you had landlords and you had farmers. So landlords, absentee landlords, were gotten the land through conquest. And they would lease the land of farmers, and then you had other people. So you start off with one land, what happens with him, they bring in more people, sort of like Crusoe economics. It's an excellent methodological presentation. His theory of utility, a value is essentially utility theory. He's also the first person to really talk about entrepreneur. Entrepreneur is an uncertainty, bearing uncertainty, brings an entrepreneur into economic thought. The theory of money was magnificent. He had the whole Hume theory, except as a process analysis. I can't use that evil word. And it was not equilibrium. In other words, it was equilibrium, but it's the process toward equilibrium. So you have, in British classical economics, of course, you have different equilibrium states. You have this state and that state. You leap somehow magically from one to the other. I talk only about the equilibrium state. With Cantillon, you talk about the process toward the new equilibrium. For example, so when Cantillon talks about what happens when the money supply increases in a country, he talks about how it's very Misesian, so to speak, pre-Misesian. It's well, the first people get it, they get the new money, they spend more, prices go up as they spend it, and their goods that they buy, then it percolates to other people, you have sort of a rippling out effect, and each group gets it until finally you have, say if you double the money supply, finally you wind up with prices more or less double, but not completely, because you have a different equilibrium now, you have different wealth effects, etc. And it's a very sophisticated, excellent analysis of international, like so-called Hume species flow analysis, except Cantillon is much better than Hume. Hume was writing about the same time, a little bit later. Actually, no, this is, say, 1730s, and Hume wrote in 1750s. Hume might probably have read it, and all these guys knew each other. The British knew the French stuff. With Cantillon, you have a pre-Austrian analysis, no question about it. It was a process thing with individuals, starting with the micro-individuals. They get new money, they spend it, and so we wind up with a let's say a doubling of prices, but not automatic doubling. You have difference, as I say, difference in price, relative prices. On the other hand, Hume, who was a Scotsman, part of the British tradition, was a brilliant writer. And I have to concede with Hume, he was one of the few people in history of thought, was a great writer, although a confused thinker. Usually the confusion and good writing, good writing and clarity of thought come together. Confusion and bad writing come together. In case of Hume, his writing was better than his theories, so to speak. Anyway, with Hume, you have a pure pre-Friedmanite, pre-monetarist analysis. In other words, it's all equilibrium states. As a matter of fact, there's a famous example which Mises uses, which is a good first approximation of what happens with money. What I call the angel Gabriel model. In other words, you're sleeping overnight. Overnight, the angel Gabriel descends to man. They hear the mankind's always bellyaching, we haven't got enough money. The angel Gabriel, benevolent but confused, but a lousy economist, says, okay, I'll fix these guys up. I'll double their money supply, and then they'll shut up, and they'll satisfy their complaints. So overnight, everybody's money supply gets doubled magically. Your bank account, your wallet, your purse, etc. gets doubled. And Hume talks about it. He doesn't use the word angel Gabriel model. That's basically what it is. And then what happens? Well, then everybody rushes out, spends it, and then according to Hume, prices overall double, and that's it. In other words, you leap quickly from the one equilibrium state to the other equilibrium state without talking about the process. But Cantillon, it's very different. You have different people's benefit and different people lose out. I mean, in this model, for example, the guys who know what's going on rush out at 6 in the morning or 8 in the morning and spend everything immediately. The other guys that decide to save it, of course, are shafted because they find the prices have doubled before they get around to spending it. So there are differences in the sort of benefit or burdens. So with Hume, a very good analysis is the first approximation of how the money supply increases in prices, but you blot out the essential pre-Austrian process and differences in micro level, and just talk about the macro. This is the beginning, by the way, of the disastrous split between micro and macro, which begins with Hume and ends with Ricardo, the final classic example, or ends with Ricardo as continues ever since. In the pre-Austrian analysis, Cantillon and Turgot only see, there's no split between micro and macro. Everything is an individual process which has different social results. It's only with, say, the British that you have There's micro, you have things going on in the micro world and supply and demand. And suddenly, in the macro world, you have quantity and velocity and all that. It's totally different. So there's no relationship between the two of them. And Cantillon, I should say something about Cantillon the man, Richard Cantillon. He's a fascinating figure. One of the reasons why he's so good about money, he was a great monetary practitioner. He was an Irish Catholic banker who moved to the Jacobite court in France where the Stuart Pretender located, and he became the banker. His cousins were always very confusing because his cousins were all named Richard, and his uncle's name was about 8 Richard Cantillons, and it's easy to get confused. One great Cantillon expert, Antoine Murphy, University of Dublin, was the great big expert on the Cantillon family. He worked the whole thing out, genealogical map. At any rate, Cantillon becomes the banker to Stuart Pretender, and becomes a big shot banker in general. And John Law, who starts off in this period, is a famous money inflation, the first big paper money inflation history. See, there was no paper money before. The first government paper money ever was 1690 in Massachusetts. Before that, gold was money. The only way the government could do anything was clip the coins to debase the coin. When paper money comes in, the great new invention for the government means you could just print money ad lib. Essentially, John Law, the Scottish adventurer, gets a hold of the royal government in Paris and convinces them he should be the central banker and print money. And through unlimited inflation, you can wipe out the public debt, you can bring prosperity and all the rest of it. So Cantillon, the legend is that Law goes to Cantillon and says, look, you're the only person here who can challenge me. Either join, well, he says, no, I'll give you 24 hours to get out, or else I'll throw you in the Bastille. Cantillon says, no, it's better for us to join forces. I'll become a Royan. So he and Law and some other guy named Beau Gade become a 3-man triad running this whole system. So but Cantillon knew the whole system was going to collapse. And what Cantillon did was he loaned a lot of money to these guys at very high interest rates, cashed it in, sold the collateral, and then skipped the company just before the great collapse of the Mississippi bubble. And came back to clean up multi-millions to the great distress and resentment of his fellow pipes. So anyway, he made millions out of this. He wrote his book as sort of a reflective response to this experience. The book was very influential, even, as I say, when it was still unpublished in the early 30s, and it became printed in 1755 after he died. And it was read by everybody in France, all the laissez-faire people, all the intellectuals, etc., etc. It was extremely influential. One of the things about Cantillon was he had mansions in every city in Europe. And probably the only economist in history of thought was murdered. I can't think of anybody else except a solemn victim or something like that. He was murdered, presumably by his disappointed servant, skipped town with his jewels or something. At any rate, but Antoine Murphy told me privately, he refuses to publish it because he said he hadn't got enough data on it yet. That's a marvelous story. He claims that Cantillon really didn't die there. He was heavily in debt. He skipped town himself and went to Borneo, where his papers or whatever remained to die 20 years later. But at any rate, yes, great character, marvelous character. Now, the thing is about Cantillon, he wasn't an exact pure free trader, but he was really, it matters as that. What he said, well, if we bring treasure into the kingdom, it will increase, when we spend the money, it will increase prices. So he advised the king not to spend the money. Great advice. In other words, all right, you get money coming in, don't spend it, sit on it. So that means we won't have inflation, we won't have this problem of deficits, balance of trade deficits, etc. Okay, after Cantillon, we had the Physiocrats in the mid-18th century, who were laissez-faire people, who were quite nutty in many ways and had various deviations. The interesting thing about Physiocrats, they were the first probably real sect or school of thought. We know the date at which the school of thought was founded. It was a date, one moment in July 1757, when Dr. Quesnay, the founder, the guru of this thing, met Mirabeau. Count Mirabeau was in those days, the Cantillonian. The Cantillon disciple immediately shifted to Quesnay. And it became a 2-man school of thought. I mean, you have to have a school of thought, you have at least 2 people. And this was it. Now, the thing is, they're both very highly placed. Quesnay was a physician, distinguished physician. He became the physician of the court, first to the king's top mistress. There was, by the way, a thing, there was one way to influence the king and try to convert him to laissez-faire, to convert the king's top mistress. This was done by Archbishop Fenelon in the early 18th century, late 17th. And Quesnay was physician to Madame de Pompadour, who was the king's top mistress, and then becomes influential at court. Mirabeau was influential. First of all, he'd just written a massive book called Offended Man. It's a multi-part work, which is incomprehensible, but the thing is, it was very popular because it was written in a 17th century style. Here it is in the mid-18th century, this guy's writing in mid-17th century style, so it sort of charmed everybody. and it was a bestseller. So Mirabeau and Cantillon, Marquis de Mirabeau, then organized the movement. Mirabeau, excuse me, and Quesnay. They set up their own school of thought, their own journals, their own doctrine. They reviewed each other's books favorably, and so forth and so on. Also, they became sort of a cult of personality. All these guys thought that Quesnay was the top guy of all time. For example, his followers claim that Quesnay looked like Socrates. Kind of difficult to figure out. We don't really know what Socrates looked like. And they also refer to him as the Confucius of Europe, the great sage of Europe. Mirabeau went so far as to proclaim that the three greatest inventions of the history of mankind were writing, money, and Quesnay's crazy diagram, the Tableau économique, for the beginning of input-output analysis. You know, the arrows. So, in any way, there were natural rights people and laissez-faire people. Unfortunately, the rule deviationists was very much in favor of high agricultural prices. One reason I think Quesnay was a farmer and he owned farms. And I think they would have been in favor of farm price supports if there's anybody proposed it. See, in those days, there were farm price supports the other direction. Farm prices were kept low, and of course, they were very much opposed to that. The maximum price controls on farm products. I think they would have been in favor of minimum price control that had come up. At any rate, there were laissez-faire people according to their lights. And their strategic objective, the question is, if you're a laissez-faire person, and this came up in late 17th century too, what do you do about it? Well, obviously the thing, do you have absolute monarchy by this time in France? The thing is, convert the king. If you convert the king, you can establish laissez-faire from the top, revolution from the top, so to speak, and that would be it. And so the strategic perspective of Fenelon and Turgot too, and the Physiocrats, convert the king, he will establish laissez-faire, and that's it. Well, how do you convert the king? Well, first of all, you convert the mistress, one route. How do you convert the king? Well, you have to convince the king it's really in his interest to have a laissez-faire system. So these tended to become utilitarian in that sense. In other words, even though Physiocrats were natural rights people, you tend to stress that it's for your benefit too, sire, if the kingdom is prosperous. And the thing is, I'm not sure they're right. And it seems to me the king can make a good case for saying the king's self-interest is to crush his inhabitants, loot every penny, and so on and so on. I think you have a problem right there in a strategic perspective. And what happened indeed when Turgot, who was a friend of the Physiocrats politically, although not economically, a laissez-faire person politically, was a top bureaucrat, finally gets in as finance minister in 1774. This is it. This is the key. This will win out. And as soon as he starts instituting laissez-faire, he's kicked out, of course, by the vested interests. And so at that point, physiocracy sort of disappears. Also, Quesnay was losing interest in economics. He was not interested in economics until in his 60s. And then he got interested in the form of cult. By his 80s, or whatever he was when he finally died, he got interested in mathematics. He claimed to square the circle, which of course is impossible. Anyway, he claimed to have solved the problem of squaring the circle. Acquiring of Turgot, I think, really did them in. Now, Turgot, I refer you to as a magnificent person. I've written a pamphlet on this thing, which is available here, I think, your Mises Institute. Turgot is magnificent, just great. My really favorite character in history of thought. Considering also the fact that he was, first of all, he spent very little time in economics. He was a busy top bureaucrat, intendant, governor. And most of his time intellectually was spent on other things, history, linguistics. He's an all-around type. Wrote and read a lot on that topic. Economic topic is only sort of did offhand. He was pressed into it when he had to tell somebody something. For example, his Reflections on Wealth, his longest book, which is about 50 pages, was written under severe time pressure. He's trying to form questions to ask two Chinese students in France about Chinese economy, or preparing them to ask about French economy. And so he wrote this as a sort of outline to himself, as a memorandum himself of what to, preparing questions to ask. This is a great work on wealth and capital theory, etc. So he wrote all this stuff under severe time pressure, sort of dashed it off, and it's absolutely magnificent. He has the whole Austrian stuff in there. Not only laissez-faire, complete laissez-faire, without any of Smith's evasions, qualifications, etc. But also he's got Austrian time preference theory, he's got Austrian Bombardian capital theory, he's got money and process analysis, he's got the whole business, and done with brilliance, just sort of in passing almost, a few clauses. And I would strongly recommend any of you, all of Turgot's economic writings have been translated into English by P.T. Groenewegen, who was a Dutch Turgotian expert in New Zealand, I think. And it's called The Economics of A.R.J. Turgot. And it's one of these things, a Dutch paperback costing about $60, things like that. It's insanely expensive, but it's worth it. And it's got very good notes and introductions and annotations by Groenewegen, Economics of Turgot. And it's just remarkable. Schumpeter is very good on Turgot. Turgot, for example, is really the originator of saved law, Smithian capital, the whole thing about, the polite constitutes the man, etc., etc. All these things are in Turgot. It's fantastic. It's difficult to overestimate his importance and his brilliance in this area. He's also got the entrepreneur in there. As a matter of fact, he says he's a little bit better than Cantillon because he stresses with capitalist entrepreneurs being particularly important. He's got the whole so-called Smithian capital theory and investment and all that, savings and investments theory. He says, well, the important thing is the capitalist entrepreneur. In other words, the person commits resources and capital to an uncertain world to entrepreneurship. He's just phenomenal, and he's again extremely influential. As I say, he's got expectations. He's got the whole thing in there. He's also got my World of Diminishing Returns, beautifully presented. Schumpeter says that it was no presentation of Law of Diminishing Returns to equal it until about 1920. He's written about 1760, 1770. All this is forgotten. This whole Turgot corpus drops out of knowledge. Again, talking about lost paradigm. Totally lost until right now, until recently, until 1960, 70. Why it's lost is an interesting story. By the way, along with Turgot, we have Condillac, the brother of Mably. He was a utility theorist and philosopher, who points out very clearly, even more clearly than Turgot, that exchange comes from double inequality of wealth, double inequality of utility. In other words, the reverse inequality of exchange I mentioned. Sets that down with absolute clarity. There's others like Galiani, who's wrote a great book on money in the age of 23 in 1751. Abbe Galiani is another great character who was Neapolitan but loved France and spent most of his time in France as a diplomat. His book on money is super. It has not been, only parts of it have been translated, unfortunately, yet. By the way, Galiani was an interesting character. He was erratic, witty, and erudite, and was 4.5 feet tall. Became a social lion of the Paris salons. As soon as he got to Paris, he began to sell out. In other words, as soon as he began to get witty and become a social lion, begins to become anti-laissez-faire and gives up the utility theory and becomes a favor of protection, effective tariff. Anyway, his great work was written before his Parisian experience. Also, I should say the founding of mathematical economics comes in about 1720. First misfortune on the road to mathematical economics by Bernoulli. I think it's Daniel Bernoulli. A whole bunch of Bernoullis, all of whom were French mathematicians, probability theorists, inventors of the calculus, things like that. Bernoulli arrived at the mathematical theory of the diminishing utility of money purely out of left field. In other words, he wasn't interested in economics at all, either before or since. He just arrived at this as part of his probability calculations, and he's got a whole series of fallacies, of course, wrapped up in this. The diminishing and marginal utility of money had already been arrived at by a couple of the Spanish scholastics in the 16th century. What he does, of course, he immediately says, well, as the du dx with the supply of money as a x and utility of u. As soon as you do that, you have about at least two major fallacies right there. One is that life is not like the calculus. There's no infinitesimally small actions in life. Everything is discrete. In other words, everything is qualitatively different, and therefore there's no infinitely small steps that we can take. It really crosses that out, crosses out calculus right there. And the UX thing is a ratio. It's a utility, is ordinal, not cardinal. There's no such thing as a ratio. You can't. Also, I don't know what it means to have a ratio of utility to money anyway. It doesn't make much sense. But since utility is ordinal and therefore not cardinal, you can't put it into a ratio. You can't equate it to anything either. So the whole thing is a whole series about fallacy piled on fallacy. It also says with no proof or no evidence whatsoever that the utility of money is an inverse proportion, declines in inverse proportion to the quantity of money. First of all, what does it mean, inverse proportion? Second of all, there's no evidence whatsoever. Some other mathematicians said, no, it's not inverse proportion to quantity of money. It's inverse proportion to the square root of quantity of money, even more silly. What does this mean? What are you talking about? More or less, much less, what's the evidence for it? Just sort of hot air. Seems to me the only way to describe this. All we know about utility of money is it declines. In other words, you have a stock of money, right? You have a falling demand curve, so to speak, falling utility, and it declines as each unit, utility of each unit declines as you add more. That's it. You don't know about it. There's no ratio, there's no inverse, nothing. And then, of course, he thought it was measurable between people, even more fallacious, and somehow you can compare everybody's utility of money and sum it up and add it up and divide it. All these things are precursors of mathematical economics, which we know and love today. It's sort of like the beginning of this stuff. And what we need to say about it. Okay, and speculation here is why does the knowledge of Cantillon and Turgot drop out? And the whole French utility, laissez-faire, time preference, whatever tradition, entrepreneurship. And why do people then think that Adam Smith founded economics? All this preceded Adam Smith. All these guys wrote before the Wealth of Nations. Kind of like wrote the same year, Commerce and Government. Unfortunately, of course, was forgotten on a great Smithian wave. Why does Smith, as Carter said, make waste and rubbish of 2,000 years of economic thought? And why was he allowed to get away with it? Why did nobody even say that he was doing this? For one thing, see, J.B. Say, who succeeds Turgot in the French tradition, never referred to Turgot or any of these people. He knew them. He was a disciple, basically, of Turgot and kind of like all these people. He was a classical liberal, laissez-faire person carrying on the battle through the French Revolution and after it. He was not just an economist, he was also a political thinker and an activist. And the question is, why did Say that Smith founded economics? Say was one of the people responsible for the myth. Why didn't he talk about the French tradition? He really disagreed with Smith on almost everything. Really, if you read the book, there was nothing Smithian about it. There's no cost of production theory, there's no liberty theory. It's all utility and productivity and hardcore laissez-faire. I think there's only the two explanations. I puzzled over this for quite some time. How the Smith myth originated and why these guys, the knowledge of the French theorists got lost. They were discredited in France itself. Discredited for two reasons. One, because Turgot was locked in with the Physiocrats, even though he really wasn't. He was a political ally of the Physiocrats. He's not an economic, way beyond the Physiocrats, who thought that agriculture was the only productive factor of production. Crazy Tableau economic state. Turgot didn't believe any of this stuff. But he was linked with the Physiocrats politically, and politically, the Physiocrats were linked up with an absolute monarchy because their strategic perspective was, in fact, they were in favor of absolute monarchy because it's simple. You convert the king and that's it. You get laissez-faire. Why mess around with democracy and mass movements? Convert the king. And in fact, they try to convert a whole bunch of kings. The great story about Catherine the Great was very interested in ideas, Western ideas, and she called these people to Russia. Mercier de la Riviere was a great French Physiocrat political theorist, natural rights theorist. Explain to me, Monsieur Riviere, about what this physiocracy is all about. And he says, well, madam, essentially the laws of nature govern natural rights and laws of nature. She said, what room is there for the king? Well, the king just follows the laws of nature. She says, thank you, monsieur, I've been very enlightening. Out. I didn't want to hear this. There's no role for the king whatsoever. As a matter of fact, there's one lovable guy, I'll finish up the list, called the Marquis of Baden, who's a Physiocrat convert, and he speaks, I think, to not Mercier, but some other, Mirabeau or somebody, and he says, gee, it seems to me there's no role for government at all in your system. You can all be laissez-faire, sort of anarchistic. A guy draws, I don't know, sign, we need the government for the framework and blah, 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 etc. And of course, Marquis was perfectly correct. The implications of laissez-faire natural rights, you don't need the government at all. But anyway, they were in favor of absolute monarchy, the Physiocrats. And so after absolute monarchy disappeared, after the French Revolution, they were politically discredited. Nobody wanted to listen to any guys in favor of absolute monarchy. And also, of course, the Physiocrats, nobody really believed by this time agriculture was the only productive factor because there was a lot of industry growing at the time. So for those two reasons, I think, the Physiocrats and Turgot got discredited, unfortunately, in France, and nobody would refer to them, and the knowledge drops out. The lost paradigm's lost. And the whole thing drops out. It's a real tragedy for economic thought, because then we're stuck for a century with the British. Essentially, Spanish Enlightenment begins with Grotius, the same guy I mentioned as a Dutch Protestant scholastic, who were Protestants but natural law people. Grotius was heavily influenced by the Spanish scholastic, by Suarez, and etc. What happens is that Pufendorf was a Lutheran Grotian. This is early 17th century. I guess Pufendorf was mid. So Grotius is early 17th century, and Pufendorf was middle or late. Pufendorf was sort of a popularizer of Grotius, so people would start reading Pufendorf and not Grotius. Grotius mentioned the Spanish scholastics, hailed them as being his predecessor. Pufendorf, being a hardcore Lutheran, hated the Catholics, refused to mention any Catholics. As a result, the knowledge of scholastic economics drops out. Scholastic political theory drops out almost forever. Pufendorf didn't mention it, and Pufendorf was read by the Scottish Enlightenment people. One reason, by the way, why knowledge of scholastic economics drops out is when Latin drops out. Scholastics, of course, usually wrote in Latin. There are not too many Latinists around. And the fact that Deliver and Schumpeter, these people actually read Latin, is one of the reasons why they were able to bring them back. So Pufendorf brings the natural law of doctrine and well, I wouldn't say laissez-faire, sort of semi-free market. It's very vague, but at least it's something. The first Scottish Enlightenment person, the first professor, I forget whether it's Edinburgh or Glasgow, it's one of the ones there, was Gershom Carmichael. He was only a professor for about 2 years before he died, but he's a professor. When they begin the professorial, before that they were readers or whatever they were, and he translates Pufendorf and writes a commentary. He's the founder of the Scottish political economic wing of the Scottish Enlightenment. And so you got Pufendorf, Carmichael, and Carmichael's the teacher of Francis Hutcheson, who in turn was the teacher of Adam Smith. We have the Carmichael Smith-Hutchison connection. By the way, Smith, the famous phrase talks about the never forgotten teacher Francis Hutcheson, praises him. However, he only praises him in a private letter to the University in Edinburgh. He never talks about Hutcheson as Wealth of Nations or anyplace else. He's part of Smith's Columbus complex. He tends to originate almost everything. At any rate, these guys are really natural law people, Carmichael, Hutcheson, etc. More or less free market and natural rights, more or less. I mean, not hardcore, but sort of soft-core classical liberals, I would say. Hutcheson, by the way, has a very good attack. One of the places where I differ with Hayek strongly on the history of thought is the status of Mandeville. Bernard Mandeville was a Dutch physician who lived in London most of his life, who wrote the Fable of the Bees and other such fables, which Hayek claims the originated the idea of spontaneous order and the free market, how free market works, and so forth and so on. I disagree with that totally. I take the Viner position, which is the Hutcheson's position, which was that essentially Mandeville was not only a statist, but also his Fable of the Bees is really a plea for sort of a pre-Keynesian plea for the glories of consumption. The saving is really bad, but it benefit the market and benefit society by consuming a lot. Hutcheson had a quick point. I think basically pointed out Hutcheson's Mandeville was only against consumption in favor of libertinism, a libertinist rather than libertarian, so to speak. I think that's the correct interpretation. I think what Viner points out is that Mandeville was a follow-up book called Letters from Dion or something like that. It becomes explicit, even more explicit than the Fable of the Bees. So we have now, and early both Carmichael and Hutcheson were essentially utility theorists, so utility scarcity theorists. Value, economic value is brought about by demand, demand and supply, and demand is caused by utility, and diminishing utility and scarcity. In other words, essentially the scholastic position, if they were Protestant scholastics. As this is true, where does the labor theory of value come in? The cost theory and labor theory, how does it come in? It's very strange. How does it come in D? It's not Hutchesonian, it's not Carmichaelian or whatever. And not only that, but Smith himself has lectures, gives the correct version. In other words, the basic, the famous paradox of value, which Smith first had on economic thought. Paradox of value, which is quite famous, is that how come if diamonds, if bread or water, whichever you want to use, is necessary to life, bread is good, the staff of life, or water is good, how come it's very cheap on the market, whereas diamonds, which are a frippery and a luxury, how come they're so expensive? In other words, you have this famous split between use value, and when you get to use value, diamonds are terrible and bread is great, but economic value somehow violates that. Smith allegedly couldn't solve this, Ricardo couldn't solve it, and so they don't talk about consumption. Consumption just drops out. You have a disastrous split between use value and economic value, which results in Marx and Veblen. The whole thing is a production for use versus production for profit. It really stems from this idea. Somehow the market values fripperies over important stuff like bread, and then it's in real life, or in real terms, bread is much more valuable. So the usual story is that Smith enunciated this paradox of value, and the Austrians finally solved it. It's not really true that Smith Hutcheson had solved it. The Scholastic had solved it. There's no problem. They realized what the problem was. That diamonds are very scarce. There's lots of bread around. It's very simple. You have an enormous amount of bread, an enormous amount of water. Each unit of water or bread is going to be worth much less than diamonds, which are, even though philosophically weaker, are much more scarce. It's relative scarcity and utility. It's the whole bit. Not only did Hutcheson solve it, but Smith himself had solved it in his lectures, his unpublished lectures at the time. Smith realized that in the Wealth of Nations, he totally changes it and poses the paradox of value, which then ruins classical economics from then on. And you might say, well, after all, the lectures were 20 years before. Maybe he's assuming everybody knows the lectures, and then it goes on. That's not true, because the lectures were never published in his lifetime, only published fairly recently, 20th century. The only thing that's quite bizarre, we have in Smith not only a decline and loss of economic thought from the French, but also from Hutcheson, and even from himself as previous persona 20 years before. This is true not only of paradox of value, it's also true of the Hume international money flow stuff, where he doesn't even have that. That drops out. The whole idea of the international money equilibrium and all that stuff drops out. It's very strange. As the Laws of Nature is a weird book. Because it embodies not only is it not true that he did not create economics, but he lost a lot of economics even from his own previous 20 years ago, his own previous being, whatever you want to call it, 20 years before. Smith is growing up, but Smith is a young man in the 1750s. Scottish Enlightenment hits Scotland, so that universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow become the shining lights, intellectual lights in Europe, especially in Britain. At this point, Oxford and Cambridge are degenerated into sort of rich man's playthings or whatever. They're not intellectually important or good at that, or useful at that time. And so, as a result, Edinburgh and Glasgow become key centers, and people come from all over Europe to study there. Smith was started off as a clubman. Clubs were very important. 18th century social life and intellectual life and everything. He was a member of about 8 different clubs, each of which had weekly meetings and things like that. It was one club, by the way, and when David Hume, his friend David Hume was president, the two were very different. They never spoke of art. They were obviously the smartest, for all their disagreements with him, and certainly the brightest people in the club. At any rate, so there's a big club life and intellectual life developing, plus the fact that we have titanic struggle between and within the Church of Scotland, which was the established church, in typical British compromise. The Anglicanism was the established church in England, and Presbyterianism was the established church in Scotland. It angered the Anglicans in Scotland, of course, tremendously, and drove them into the Jacobite camp, by the way. And of course, the pure Calvinists, or whatever, the dissident faction, broke off and established the Free Kirk of Scotland. At any rate, in the established Scottish Presbyterian church, there's a titanic struggle between the moderates, as they were called, and the evangelicals. The moderates consisted of all the bright people and the Murphy types in Scotland and Glasgow and Edinburgh, and the evangelicals, everybody else. The oppressed rural masses. As a result of fantastic maneuvering, even though the moderates were in the minority, they were able to control the church until about 1800. That was for approximately 50 years or so. Headed by Principal Robertson, William Robertson, a whole bunch of other people of whom Smith was a member. And they all knew each other, and they all were friends and compatriots. Even though the moderates were not as hardcore Calvinists, obviously, as the evangelicals, they were still pretty Calvinistic, especially Smith. Hume was at the least. Hume was, I guess, was tending toward deism or atheism or whatever. Hume couldn't find an academic post in Scotland, by the way. An interesting commentary on academia, where a guy couldn't find a university post. Because of his religious views. He was not impoverished, however, since he was a high aristocrat, independently wealthy aristocrat, member of the Hume family, which I think emerged now in Douglas Hume and all that, all the same group. So Smith starts off in this environment, however, was also deeply Calvinist, even though moderate. His mother wanted him to become an Anglican minister and sent him to Oxford, I believe, in order to, part of an Anglican fellowship. When you graduate, you're supposed to become an Anglican minister, and he said, heck with that. And when he became a Glasgow professor, he had to sign a Westminster Confession, which was one of the requisites, and he had no difficulty, apparently, signing it. I think this accounts, well, not only for his adoption of labor theory of value late in the game, and discarding the utility theory, also for other things. One of his deviations from laissez-faire, one of his many deviations, I'll get into in a minute, was he was in favor of usury laws. In other words, he was in favor of maximum interest rate laws, restricting the supply of credit. Eddie West is a friend of mine, was a biographer of Smith and worshipped Smith, Edwin G. West. Couldn't understand this. He said, when we had a discussion at the Cantillon conference, where Smith, of course, came in as the general object of attention. West said, well, gee, Smith deviated. He should have understood that if you have a maximum, like maximum price control, if you have a maximum interest rate, it will restrict the supply of credit and so forth. And he didn't seem to realize that. It's sort of a hole in his doctrine. Roger Garrison, who gave a comment on that, was an Austrian, pointed out, quite the contrary, Smith understood all too well what the consequence was. And he wanted to restrict the supply of credit. That's the whole point. He understood that usury laws would restrict the supply of credit, and he loved it. He wanted to do it. Why? Because he hated consumption. He wanted credit to be channeled into the prime borrowers who pay prime interest rates, the low interest rate borrowing. He wanted to exclude from credit. He wanted to ration credit so that speculators and high consumer types, with non-Calvinist types, would not get credit. He wanted to channel credit away from dissolute types, okay? And was quite conscious on his part, and I think it's absolutely correct. Even when you get to the diamond water or diamond bed paradox, the way he talks about it is kind of interesting. He doesn't say that diamonds are a luxury and therefore of lesser value. He says diamonds are of no value. No value. And he's a constant thing with Smith, of an attack on consumption and attack on immaterial consumption. And one of the reasons I think why he adopts the idea that some labor is productive, labor which embodies material objects, and other labor which is unproductive, in other words, services. He wasn't so much interested in material objects, he was interested in capital. He wanted capital investment. In other words, he disagreed with the time preference, the saving consumption preferences of the market. He wanted more saving and less consumption, basically. And one of the ways, the usury laws is one way to channel consumption into prime borrowers. And in general, he disliked consumption, fripperies. He wanted to tax consumption. He wanted all sorts of ways by which he would, as they restructure the preferences of the market. And it all fits in with what I postulate as the Calvinist approach to all this, where luxury becomes evil. Anything beyond moderate consumption becomes wicked. So that was one of his deviations. The idea of productive labor fits right into that, and building up capital investment. It's sort of the opposite deviation from the Physiocratic Mandeville one, where only consumption is good and saving is evil. This is the opposite. And a lot of free market economists, by the way, still hold this. It's not if you read any economic literature, financial literature. The supply siders, for example, will say we have to lower marginal tax rates because we want people to save and invest more. Saving and investment good, but if saving and investment good, then the consumption must be in some way bad. Therefore, people are adjusting their own proportion. And so you read a lot of this, you'll get the same sort of, even now, the same sort of idea that saving good and, of course, consumption bad is not really explicitly stated, but, of course, is part of the paradigm. In other words, very few people are willing to allow the market, individuals in the market to decide their own saving investment preferences. In addition to the fact that he leaves out the productive labor stuff, creates a lot of problems. Theory of value is totally confused. He's a very confused writer. The theory of value is about 3 or 4 independent coexisting theories of value in there. On one hand, he puts too much emphasis on the division of labor to neglect of investment of capital. On the other hand, in his later books, toward the end of the book, he attacks the division of labor, causing alienation and all the rest of the stuff. With he's sort of a pre-Marxian anti-alienation. One of the things, by the way, one of the reasons why he worries about the division of labor is that it weakens the martial spirit of the people. If you're there, I don't know, if you're making parts of the pin or you're tightening bolts, you'll somehow lose the spirit of going out and conquering. And he's very, in that sense, very pro-war, something is fairly overlooked. In his theory of money, he leaves out even the Hume stuff, much less the Cantillon stuff on money and prices. He leaves out a lot of stuff. He leaves out a lot of stuff that either he had or Hutcheson had previously. I have a list of a compilation of deviations from laissez-faire of Smith. They're pretty long, I'll tell you that. Of course, there's the Navigation Acts, there's national defense, which include practically everything. The martial spirit decay. He's in favor of government-run education. And orders that inculcate obedience to the state among the populace. Scarcely a laissez-faire doctrine. I quote from Smith, an instructed and intelligent people, besides, are always more decent and orderly than an ignorant and stupid one. They feel themselves more respectable and more likely to obtain the respect of their lawful superiors, says Smith, and they are therefore more disposed to respect those superiors. They are less apt to be misled in any wanton or unnecessary oppositions to the measures of government. That's why he's in favor of government-run education. Kind of a status, let's face it. Nonsense about him being a laissez-faire person. He was in favor of regulating bank paper, allowing fractional reserve banking, which most of his predecessors were against, by the way, including Hume. Hume was a hardcore 100% gold person. He thought old banking, fractional reserve banking was fraud. Most of his friends and his predecessors did. It was only Smith that starts bringing in bank credit. He's in favor of public works, including highways, bridges, and harbors. On the rationale that private enterprise would, quote, would not have the incentive, unquote, to maintain them properly, a rather odd position to take. And a particularly lengthy list of taxes which he advocated, each of which interfered in the free market. For example, he's sort of a pre-Georgist, as Ricardo was definitely a pre-Georgist. See, all these guys, including Smith, believe that the landlord had no function. And the farmers had a function, but landlords, just ownership of land was functionless, and therefore can be taxed. It's a tax on unearned, tax on rent, the whole smearing of rent, the whole vicious smear of rent, which really starts with Smith, and of course Ricardo maximizes it. But they didn't understand, for example, that landlords perform a very important function, namely allocating scarce land. I mean, it's an extremely important function, because they didn't think in terms of allocation. He also favored taxes on import of foreign manufacturers, moderate taxes on the export of raw wool. A lot of, even within the free trade thing, he had a lot of deviations on that. And heavy taxes on luxurious consumption, as I mentioned. Taxes on luxury carriages. Specifically, the quote, tax the indolence and vanity of the rich, unquote. Once again, the Calvinist thrust. It also has, a puritanical hostility to liquor, which even though he's not a post-millennialist, but the anti-liquor thing was already there. He called for heavy tax on distilleries in order to crack down on hard liquor and induce people to drink instead of the quote, wholesome and invigorating liquor of beer and ale. Somehow that was okay. Whereas hard liquor was evil, sin. But even on ale, he was in favor of a high retail tax on retail sales of all liquor to discourage ale houses. And of course, he's also in favor of the soak the rich policy, progressive income taxation. Let it never be forgotten with Smith. And he says who would wear a Smith tie after this, right? Also, I say usury was I already gotten into, even though Turgot and Cantillon already blasted usury law off the face of the map. Even Bentham was against usury laws. Even Bentham was one of my least favorite people also. Now, the interesting thing about Smith, one of the most interesting, charming things, there's an article by Gary Anderson, I think Tollison was involved in this thing, right? A marvelous article called Adam Smith and the Custom House. One of the interesting things about Smith, he was this great free trade, laissez-faire person. How come he spent the last 12 years of his life as a customs official, not just a customs official, but a member of the customs commissioners, running the whole customs system, extracting tariffs and all that, cracking down on smugglers. How do you square this? The usual whitewash of Smith is, well, he just uses it as a sinecure. It's called a no-show job, like in the Bronx, we have pothole inspectors. For $8,000 a year, if you find a pothole, you'll report it. You call in. This is a pothole every 5 yards. It's very easy to do this. So, but it turns out, however, it was not a no-show job. He worked hard at it. He was there 3 days a week, and it was full-time, and he loved it. Not only that, he had no qualms about it. He loved it. He was writing letters to people saying, boy, oh boy, we got another smuggler today, and we were cracking down on these people. Sort of like Reagan claiming he's against income taxes and maximizing IRS funds and power, right? And you ask yourself, well, which is he really in favor of? Well, you look at his actions. Speak louder than the words here. Some people claim, well, it's too bad that Smith didn't do any more academic work and the intellectual work of the wealth of the nation. But he said, no, he loved this. He could have gotten a top academic post with almost as much money. He liked this stuff. It was great. Somebody went to Scotland, Arthur Anderson and son, found the minutes of the customs house and actually found out what he was saying and what he was doing, cracking down. Just one quote from Smith. He writes to a fellow customs official in December 1785, and he says, may perhaps give the gentleman pleasure, means the guy he's writing to be informed that the net revenue arising from the customs in Scotland is at least 4 times greater than it was 7 or 8 years ago when he took over. It has been increasing rapidly these 4 or 5 years past, and the revenue of this year is overleaped by at least 1/2 the revenue of the latest former year. I find myself as likely to increase still further. Well, God bless him. Hardly, however, a champion of laissez-faire and free trade. So and he gets this undeserved reputation of being the founder of economics, and the other guys are lost. And we come to some Smithians now. I think there's Dougal Stewart, for example, was Smith's descendant in the University of Glasgow. Very few people study under Smith himself, but everybody you can think of studied under Stewart. For about 10 or 15 years, he was the big shot professor of political economy at Glasgow. James Mill studied under him, a whole bunch of other people, McCulloch and the whole Scottish group. When we get to the labor theory of value, it's pretty clear that the propounders of labor theory of value, not only Smith, but also his direct descendants, James Mill, who was Scottish, originally a top Scottish Calvinist who was studying for the Presbyterian ministry. And as somebody said, when James Mill went to London, he lost his Calvinist faith. He became an atheist, but he continued with the same zeal for world salvation and crushing the enemy or whatever they had before. His cadre doctrines continued apace. As a matter of fact, there's a great quote about James Mill is that when he was a hardcore Calvinist, he hated Hume for skepticism. And when he was an atheist, he also hated Hume for the same reason. Hume was too muddle-headed and skeptical, and so it wasn't hardcore enough. Kind of a charming doctrine. Okay, well, Bentham was a Smithian, started off life as a Smithian, devoted Smithian. He wrote his only good book, I think, is Defense of Usury, in which he attacked Smith for selling out on the usury question. He wrote that in the 1790s when he was a Smithian. Bentham, of course, was not the founder, but probably the big systematizer of utilitarianism, a bitter opponent of natural rights, natural law, whatever. When we had to cut through the Benthamite movement, a whole bunch of Benthamites around, you cut through, you find the core of Benthamism, which is pretty monstrous. Of course, Bentham really is the founder of modern economics, the sense of welfare economics, cost-benefit analysis. It all comes in with Bentham. These people, James Mill and John Stuart Mill, are essentially Benthamites, and bring in the Benthamite, replacing whatever natural law doctrine there was. And I think it's all fallacious. I mean, the personal utilitarianism is fallacious, and certainly social utilitarianism, where you try to add up personal utilities and personal benefits and figure out what the maximum general greatest good for the greatest number is. It's obvious nonsense. You can't add them up. Because all utility is subjective and ordinal. Bentham's famous phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number, which is sort of his cornerstone of his doctrine. One of the problems with that, of course, one of the many problems, is supposing you're in a lesser number, then what? What happens then? Utilitarianism can justify almost everything. I think Benthamites would admit this. In other words, there's no justice. No such thing as natural rights, justice, or anything else. It's all manipulating everything for alleged cost-benefit arguments. For example, take the idea, on punishment theory, which is an arcane part of libertarian doctrine. The Benthamites are, of course, pure deterrence theorists. They don't believe in justice. It's all deterrence. Well, deterrence doesn't have, for example, to deter. Take, for example, this sort of situation. Most people don't want to commit murder for whatever reason. They don't like it. They're against it. They're reluctant to commit murder. On the other hand, a lot of people are willing to steal an apple from the push cart or from the fruit store. Therefore, according to pure deterrence theory, punishment for murder should be very light, and punishment for apple stealing should be capital punishment, preferably in public, to make an example of the stealer. And most of us think there's something wrong with this. It's what the philosophers call counterintuitive, or it was nutso. Most of it have a view of justice, even when we don't have an articulated theory of it. Bentham throws that all out. Benthamites also in favor, example, of punishing the innocent, execute the innocent, provided the public doesn't know they're innocent. The public thinks they're guilty, it's good enough, right? Why not? And no moral principles and whatever. What I want to talk about with Bentham is the panopticon, which is the key to his thought, which Benthamites don't like to talk about. This is Bentham's great project. He's a great projector. He wrote millions of words, much of which, fortunately, have not been published yet. But he had a fleet of secretaries, very wealthy aristocrat, and so we had employed secretaries to take them down, copy them. There was no, of course, Xerox machine or typewriter at that epoch. He was sort of living reductio absurdum in his own, his panopticon was living reductio absurdum in his own thought. He used to be a Tory. He was a Tory aristocrat. He converted to democracy, actually converted by James Mill, because the Tories wouldn't adopt his doctrine, his panopticon. He figured nothing could be worse than that. Maybe the democracy will adopt my panopticon. Panopticon was a theory which Benthamite apologists claim only applied to prisons. It did not apply only to prisons. It's an excellent, very amusing article. There's a lot of good stuff. Douglas Long has a book called Bentham and Liberty, a very good scholarly work. Gertrude Himmelfarb, usually not one of my favorite people, being a neoconservative, an excellent critique of Bentham called The Haunted House of Jeremy Bentham in her book on Victorian minds. Panopticon was a scheme not just for the prisoner, for almost everybody, for the poor, for children, for vagrants. I mean, everybody be rounded up. It's been estimated by Bentham himself from a third to two-thirds of the population be incarcerated in panopticons, which were essentially compulsory concentration camps. It was nice with scientifics. There's no such thing as justice or privacy. It's all cost benefit, right? You maximize surveillance, and so you have one guy sitting in the center of a circle, and all the prisoners and kids and whatever you want, paupers, are all lined up so you can see into them. And of course, this was before the age of television and all that. Brilliant prophecy of the Orwellian future. Even though you couldn't see everybody every time, nobody would know when you're seeing them, so everybody would feel he's under surveillance. Bentham felt as a utilitarian. That's very important for everybody to feel at all times he's under surveillance by Big Brother, okay, by the panopticon leadership. And so this would keep them, not only keep them on the straight and narrow, keep them working to the max. We want to get maximum production out of them. Let's see, 12.5 hours a day at forced labor and so on and so on. And everything beautifully worked out. The idea, of course, to have maximum production by these slave labor, which is essentially what it was. Panopticon, by the way, is Greek for all seeing. That's the controller who sees everything. So like the old Big Brother. Also, inspection house is another way to put it. This is a big reform. Himmelfarb puts it very neatly. He said Bentham by this time was an atheist. She says Bentham did not believe in God, but he did believe in the qualities that popularized like in God. The panopticon was a realization of the divine ideal, spying out the ways of the transgressor, or potential transgressor, by means of an ingenious architectural scheme, turning night into day with artificial light and reflectors, holding men captive by an intricate system of inspection. The panopticon becomes omniscient and omnipotent, omnipresence of the inspector. This is what makes things most efficient for the goals of the inspectors. At one point, Bentham, so there might be some drawing back to adopt my scheme, because it might be said that these people become robots instead of people. It might be, as he says, productive of an imbecility. So the formerly free man would no longer, in a deep sense, be fully human. And he asked himself whether the result of this high-wrought contrivance might not be constructing a set of machines out of the similitude of men. And to this critical question, he gives the utilitarian reply, brutal, brusque, and utilitarian, namely, who cares? Who cares if they're just machines? The only real question is, would happiness be most likely to be increased or diminished by this discipline? Of course, he being a scientist of happiness could answer the question very neatly. Namely, as he said, they'll be happy almost by definition. Call them soldiers, call them monks, call them machines, he says. So there are but happy ones I should not care. As Isabel Patterson would call the humanitarian with a guillotine or the slave pen. So economy and productivity were what he was trying to maximize. As he put it, industry is a blessing. 7.5 hours a day was enough for sleep, an hour and a half total for meals, the rest of the time they're working on a forced labor regime. The punchline of this whole thing, whole panopticon scheme, is that he would run it, and it would be a private property, privately owned panopticon. Giant panopticon, slave labor would be owned by him. He meant them. We get to extract the profits from the slave laborers. And this way we have a unity of private and public institutions. And so he tried to lobby in Parliament, lobby the court, and never get it through. Fortunately for Great Britain, Bentham had a group of secretaries. The most interesting secretary was James Mill, whom I now turn, who in a sense was the founder of the Ricardian system. I really think more and more we find out about Mill. I think is a fascinating character. Not John Stewart, not Olimpo, but James Mill, the father. James Mill, I call him the radical's Lenin, a real cadre type, a real Bolshevik type in every sense, personally, ideologically, whatever. Although he was semi-libertarian, he basically had this kind of mindset. I say he was originally a Scottish Presbyterian minister, comes to London and makes a precarious living as a freelance writer, which is always precarious, and latches on to Bentham. That has a lot of money, and writing all the time, becomes a secretary. He always tried to organize everybody. He's a cadre type person. He's organizing his kid, John Stewart. He's organizing everybody, his friends, his wife. Everybody's being organized in a cadre manner. So he's trying to organize Bentham. Bentham was very unsystematic, would scribble all night or whatever, and kept saying, Bentham, why don't you work on this, complete this book, and then we'll get you the next book. Bentham was writing with friends. This young whippersnapper was trying to organize me. So it was a sort of cultural temperament, clash of temperament. It was Mill who talked Bentham into being a Democrat. But Mill had his own reasons for being in favor of universal suffrage, democracy, universal suffrage. He adopted Bentham's utilitarianism and believed in laissez-faire much more than Bentham at this point. But he felt that he was a true Benthamite. James Mill, he's a very creative thinker, one of the most creative thinkers of this whole modern period, but always pretended, in contrast to Smith and a lot of other people, he originated everything. He kind of, no, I'm just a number two man. I'm a faithful Benthamite. I'm a faithful Ricardian. I'm just a mouthpiece of the great Bentham, the great Ricardo. Whereas actually he was contributing much to the doctrine. He was one of the few people in history who thought underplayed his own role. And I was talking to my old friend Leonard Liggio about this, and what is the it's kind of strange. He said, well, maybe there might be an economic explanation for this, which I'm quick for this. I wasn't quick enough on the mark. The economic explanation being that Mill was impoverished, freelance writer, was Bentham was very wealthy, and Ricardo was very wealthy. And so this pretension of being a humble number two man might have an personal economic financial motive. Yes, master, as a source of a lot of pay. In fact, Bentham kept Mill going for many years until Mill wrote his history of British India, history of India. Anyway, he does the same thing with Ricardo. He finds Ricardo as a retired stockbroker, really bond dealer, what it was. Ricardo's whole ambition was to retire and become a country squire. Forget it, a young retired person. And Mill keeps nagging him. No, you got to be the great economist. He keeps, quote, forcing, unquote, Ricardo to write this book, and keeps correcting every chapter. Every chapter Ricardo gives to Mill, and Mill corrects it and adds stuff to it. Important thing. Rewrites it and gets him to publish it. And then he said, okay, now you got to be our cadre leader in Parliament of the philosophical radicals. Mill organized the philosophic radical cadre in Parliament. He had about 20 or 30 MPs of the 1830s, which had a balance of power position, quite powerful. And it turns out, more and more, that Mill really originated much of the Ricardian system. For example, one of the few good things in the Ricardian system is the law of comparative advantage. That international trade, you can have, even if one country or one person, of course, is terrible in everything, unproductive in almost everything, it'd still be an advantage to trade with it, because it's the advantage of everybody if they concentrate on the least unproductive area and trade with somebody else who concentrates on the most productive area. So you don't have to be an absolute advantage in anything. You just have a comparative advantage. Ricardo turns out that not only didn't originate it, James Mill originated it and forced Ricardo to put it in because Ricardo wasn't interested in it. Ricardo had only one interest in life, namely crush the unproductive landlord class. Since he believed that the landlords were unproductive weight and rent will inexorably increase and messing everything up, he tried to postpone the inevitable by lowering rents. And the way to lower rents was to import wheat, or corn as they call it. The import wheat. At least for a few years, you'll keep down the rental value and lower the price of wheat, and keep the economy going until the whole thing cracks. So Ricardo's only interest in free trade was to lower the price, was the free trade and the importation of wheat, and because of this rent theory. Mill was also a Ricardian in that sense. He also had the general free trade position, plus a comparative advantage, which he put into Ricardo's book, which stands out like a sore thumb, like a page or 2 pages, which Ricardo never referred to anyplace else. Ricardo's real interest is the monetary theory, of course, money and banking, which I don't got time to go into. And the rest of it might well have been. We don't know really how much Mill has contributed. Mill had endless correspondence, endless walks with Ricardo, giving him the line. And we don't really know how much this stuff was James Mill. And Ricardo said, well, James Mill changed my life and all that sort of stuff. James Mill was a fantastic, very charismatic figure. Changed everybody's life was around him and so forth and so on. And so much of it might be the Millian system. An interesting thing about Mill, is the fact he was one of the inventors of libertarian class analysis, class conflict theory. before the Saint-Simonians. About the same time as Compton Dunway. I'm not sure who was first. I'm not sure, but it was independent on most part, whether he learned it from, say, Charles Comte was J.B. Say's son-in-law and libertarian analyst. They were much more sophisticated and they had a historical approach, which Mill didn't have, so I presume he probably got it from them. Basically, libertarian class conflict analysis says, contrast to Marx, which where capitalists and workers are in inexorable class conflict, the only class conflict comes from the state. In other words, the state exists and does something. There's a ruling class and a ruled class right away. Taxation, tax consumers and taxpayers, the people get benefits from the state, the people lose by the state, that creates class conflict. Everything else on the free market is harmony. Class conflict comes about through the state. So Compton Dunway had this, and they said, well, industrialization requires free markets and free trade. And as the state withers away, class conflict will be eliminated. We'll have a classless society, not in the sense of a communist society, but in the sense of free market. That was the Compton Dunway approach. Well, Mill had something similar, except it was narrower. Basically, in Mill said there were two classes in society: the ruling few and the ruled many. There's always a ruling class. The ruling class is exploiting the public through taxes and controls, etc., etc. And his object was eliminated, have pure free laissez-faire. The reason why he was in favor of democracy is he felt that if you have pure democracy and universal suffrage, the public can't exploit themselves as there's always a minority. Therefore, the public will guard against the emergence of a ruling class. Of course, as we now know, was an incorrect theory. It made a certain amount of sense in that period before democracy was tried. But at any rate, that was his objective. He convinces Bentham to go along. Convinces Bentham of Bentham's idea, which it really wasn't. And then he starts cadre activity in that direction for pure democracy and laissez-faire. He thought democracy was more important than laissez-faire because democracy is the key thing. If you have universal suffrage, then laissez-faire would flow from it inexorably. He then arranged his followers on a cadre basis, using, for example, organized deception. There's some very good books, Joseph Hamburger, very good books on James Mill. One is called John Stuart Mill and the Intellectuals, which is really about James Mill mostly. The other is called The Art of James Mill and the Art of Revolution. What he shows was James Mill wrote books and journal articles all the time. He wrote books on practically everything. He wrote a book on logic, a book on psychology, a book on utilitarianism and economics, books on everything, plus journal articles, plus organizing his friend's kid and wife, and plus organizing a cadre in Parliament. I mean, I don't know how the hell he did it. Unbelievable. He also organized a reform campaign of 1832, the Reform Bill, for open suffrage to the middle class in England, which to him was a way station on the road to universal suffrage. He really pushed it through by an organized campaign of cadre deceit. In other words, he got control of most of the press by various means, most of the top newspapers. He got them to lie about the idea there was a revolution out there. If you don't pass the reform bills, the masses will revolt. It was pure fiction. There was no revolution or nothing. And he got the Whig government. He steered the Whig government into thinking it was going to be a revolution if they didn't pass the bill. He also worked out a theory about why lying is good. First of all, some people don't deserve the truth. And secondly, that especially politically, they don't necessarily deserve the truth. And this is lying in a higher utilitarian good. Anyway, he did this and was successful. It was only discovered really about 10 years later when his aide-de-camp, his chief aide, John Rothbard, wrote a history of a reform bill and how it was put through. And the whole cadre were devoted to Mill. And they figured he's the guy, and they take orders from him at all times, etc., etc. And the reason why he brainwashed his kid, and it's something very first famous thing, where John Stuart Mill gets brainwashed, learns Latin at the age of 2 days or whatever it was. The reason he didn't do it just for the hell of it. He didn't do it in order to try out his theories of education on his kid. He did it because the kid was supposed to be his successor as cadre leader. The kid had a moral historical responsibility to carry forth leadership of the cadre. He wasn't just an ordinary kid. That was his basis of it. Of course, he flopped. I mean, John Stuart was a cadre leader until the old man died. John Stuart Mill lived in deception. God was not only muddle-headed, John Stuart, but also engaging in total deceit almost at all times. For example, he wrote an article praising Bentham. This is while the father was still alive, and a Benthamite. Praising Bentham, writing it publicly, and at the same time writing an anonymous article attacking Bentham. Right? I mean, this is he's messed up. It's very elite. This really discloses the fact he was no longer a cadre leader until his father died. That was about 8 years later or something. Anyway, what happens with Ricardianism, I think, again, it's very difficult, first of all, to understand what Ricardo was talking about. Understand what Ricardo was talking about. Both Ricardo and J.B. Say were trying to understand Smiths. This is very confusing. As I said, about 3 or 4 different theories of value at the same time, using words in an obscure manner and so forth and so on. Both they said, well, this is a great book. We know it's a great book, which we know what the hell he's saying. So they're trying to systematize Smith. Say does it as really as a Turgot disciple. It's really not a Smithian. And Say's whole book, I recommend, by the way, Say's treatise on political times, a marvelous book. It's still in the old 1860 edition or something, right? It's still the translation of 1821 or something, and it's a marvelous book. It's straight Turgot. It's entrepreneurs, key marginal productivity, not marginal, but productivity. Explanation of factor prices is there. Utility theory is there. Entrepreneurs are there very heavily. The whole thing is a Turgotian book. It's not a Smithian, even though he says Smith was the greatest. And the only thing Smithian is what Smith picked up from Turgot, namely saving and Say's law. Is essentially the old Turgot thing of saving is okay. There results in investment, no problem, not overproduction and all that. It's really a Turgot law, which Smith gets, and then Say gets from Smith or Turgot. And Smith is also the classical liberal libertarian leader of a movement, in addition to being an economist of note. In addition to that, Say was very hardcore on banking. He was 100% banking gold theorist. And all the people, Compton, Newland, Bosdale, all these people essentially Say in the same movement. They're all disciples, descendants, J.B. Say. The marvelous book, great stuff. The only thing bad about it is he thinks it's Smith he says it's Smith originated, but I can't believe he really meant it. Meantime, Ricardo is writing what I can only call verbal mathematics. The only thing worse than mathematics is verbal mathematics. In other words, with a style, you're writing mathematical equations in linguistic form. So the whole thing becomes, it's an equilibrium analysis, which is where you're trying to set some things constant, other things variable, but putting it in words, and which makes it almost incomprehensible. Of course, the theory of rent not only says that landlords are unproductive, it also says that rent is not really a part of cost because rent is differential. I mean, the differential rent is that the poorest land is earns zero rent, and therefore any rent is really just a differential. It's not really earned, so to speak. Of course, you could say the same thing about wages. Wages are not a part of cost because anything above unskilled labor then becomes a differential which can be taxed away, whatever. Ricardo leads directly, not himself, but his followers. Henry George is a straight Ricardian. Marx is a Ricardian labor theory of value, which Ricardo lifted from Smith. In other words, Ricardo systematized Smith by taking the worst stuff in Smith and making a system out of it. And Say systematized by taking the best stuff. And so that's, I think, the difference. They only agreed, saying Ricardo, on Say's law. Or again, Ricardo's in the same Turgot-Smith tradition. The thing that happens to Ricardo, the whole system, labor theory of value, theory of rent, etc., again, there's a myth, which you've probably all, I'm sure you've all read, namely the Ricardianism dominated English economics until Jevon, until 1870s or even 1880s in Marshall. It's not true. We now know that Ricardianism died out by about 1830. In other words, he died by 1822. In 6 or 7 years, Ricardianism had been smashed by all sorts of people, by utility theorists like Samuel Bailey, by anti-rent people like Thompson, anti-Ricardian rent theory. And so by 1830, Colonel Torrens was addressing the political economy club, so nobody's Ricardian anymore. How many, the Ricardian system is finished. And so we had a whole bunch of things going on, very interesting stuff. The Irish theorists, the Trinity College Dublin, had a whole bunch of utility theorists, subjective utility theorists, were excellent. Put in by Archbishop Whately, a very interesting character, was the English, and was a professor at Oxford, a master of Oriel College, and he was fighting the fight against the High Churchmen in Oxford, the High Tories. He was a latitudinarian type. And when he becomes Archbishop of Dublin, he immediately sets up a Whately chair for political economy and puts in, for the rest of his life, selects the holders of it, and every one of them is utility theorists until he dies. So that carries on. Longfield and Button, all these people, of course, they're sort of outside the English mainstream. Usually Englishmen don't care what's going on in Ireland, so not that influential. But going along, adding the whole thing up, Nassau Senior has some excellent stuff. Nassau Senior was very anti-Ricardian stuff without explicitly saying it. And of course, again, something which I should have gone into, but I haven't got the time, is the Malthusian thing, which comes from Smith. Malthus gets to the anti-population stuff, of course, from Smith. The iron law of wages and all that is really it's really derived from it. And Ricardo, of course, is this big Malthusian on population, not on other things. And Senior essentially smashes that without saying so, and essentially demolishes. I mean, it's strange about Malthus, by the way. Here's a guy growing up after 50 years of the Industrial Revolution, an explosion of fantastic explosion of standard of living, and worrying about population increase. I mean, it was much more apropos 100 years before, when nobody was a Malthusian. But he waits, so to speak, the Malthusian problem was over and sets it up as a real problem, a big problem of population pressure. So what happens is that basically Ricardianism was finished until John Stuart Mill resurrects it, monstrous work of 1848. In other words, from 1823 to 1848, there was no Ricardian domination of English economics. It was a free flow of utility theorists, there were anti-Ricardian rent theorists, etc. There's one very interesting character I can't omit in this thing. A fascinating character named John Rae, who was a Scotsman. And one person Bombardier does acknowledge as being a pre-Bombardian, pre-time preference, pre-capital Austrian capital theorist. And he's a very strange duck. He's a Scottish physician who's sort of unemployed and doesn't do well. He has a marital problem. Anyway, he leaves Scotland for Canada. And he's a very contentious character anyway. He gets involved in Canadian Calvinist politics between, I forget now which faction he was in. Anyway, he was in the losing faction. He had essentially kicked out of Canada and leaves for, I forget what it was, Hawaii. I think probably Hawaii, or some minor Hawaiian island. He stays there for the rest of his life as a village physician. Anyway, he writes this thing. His passion in life was geography. He's a definitive work on Canadian geography, Canadian geology and all that. And he's a big protectionist. He's pro-protection, protective tariff, and he hates Adam Smith. So he writes a book in the 1840s designed to attack Adam Smith and free trade. And then he says, well, before I talk about free trade protection, I have to deal with capital theory. And he works out a whole Austrian capital theory, and no relationship with free trade whatsoever, protection. Works out, it's a fantastic thing. He works this whole thing out. He publishes, the publisher was a New England protectionist, who publishes a good firm anti-Jacksonian, anti-free trade book. He publishes this book, nobody can understand what he's talking about. And he says, gee, this says nothing about protection really, it's worthless. And so nobody reads it. And the guy disappeared, goes to Hawaii or something. And anyway, John Stuart Mill read it because he read almost everything anyway. And somebody showed it to him. He reads it. This is a good book. And he praises John Rae's book for the wrong reason. He doesn't understand it too well. He doesn't get the pre-Bombardier stuff at all. He praises it. And poor Rae gets a clipping, I think, from Mill. This is many years after the book was written. He said, gee, so thank you, Mr. Mill, because you're the only person who ever talked about my book. Like it. It's kind of pathetic. Poor guy's writing as a Hawaii village physician. That was it. Nobody referred to it until about 1900 when Peter Mixter discovered it, and then Bombardier said, you're right, Bombardier hadn't heard of it either, and praised it. So anyway, he's a very, very interesting character. So all this was going on, and Mill's book comes in and reestablishes Ricardianism, and Mill had such tremendous prestige by this time as a philosopher, logician, intellectual, etc., etc., that everybody just fell for it. It just sort of toppled over and adopted this, and the whole utility stuff drops out, and the non-Ricardian rent theory drops out, and the whole thing just sort of caves in. And Mill becomes dominant, JS, from 1848 until the 1880s, let's say. So that's really the dominance, the resurgence of Ricardianism. Also, in addition to that, Mill establishes positivism as a self-conscious methodology for the first time. The previous classical economists say was explicitly what we call now praxeologists. This is deductive. You start with self-evident axioms and deduce economic theory. Senior was definitely a self-conscious praxeologist. And Mill said, no, Mill starts the idea of false assumptions, the pre-Friedmanite view. You have to have false assumptions, which you then deduce and test and all that sort of stuff. It really begins with Mill. And Mill having great prestige, which the others, of course, didn't have, essentially wins out. And of course, with Alfred Marshall, that's sort of the same thing with marginal utility theory. Marginal utility theory comes in the 1870s, Jevon in England, and Valra in Switzerland, and Menger in Austria. Marshall's function in life was to bury marginal utility theory with faint praise. In other words, to reestablish Ricardo and Mill. That was his whole goal in life. He unfortunately succeeded in Britain. When I went to college, I read Marshall's Principles of Economics straight through. That was our seminar. We had a seminar. What we do is read Marshall's Principles. It's great, much better than reading Keynes or something. That was what we did. First of all, if you read Marshall, you see evangelicalism, you see the pietism shining through, constantly making pietist moral arguments throughout, in the midst of talking about the representative firm and all that. But more important here is that what he's doing, he takes marginal utility and he trivializes it. In other words, confines it to consumption. Okay, it's true about consumption, you get the diminishing marginal utility, and that's it. It's true they solve the value paradox. And from then on, he talks about production, he talks about cost, and cost is the key thing. And so the real essence of the utility theory drops out. And since when I was going to graduate school or college in the 40s, the general view was that Marshall had integrated anything of value in the Austrians. That was it. Go on Marshall. Any good stuff is in Marshall. The rest of the stuff doesn't have to be read. The view here is that, as Marshall's famous phrase, value is determined by scissors of supply and demand. You have the demand scissors, point of you have the rising supply curve, which is the cost determined by cost, allegedly, and these two scissors determine market price. However, This really starts with Smith. Of course, Ricardo emphasized it. Key thing is not market price. Who cares about market price? Key thing is long-run normal pricing and with equilibrium prices, which you never get at anyway. That's much more important. And long-run normal, Marshall claimed the supply blade or the cost blade is triumphant. Demand sort of drops out, and the really important part of the scissors, the important blade, is cost. Objective cost determined by labor utility and whatever. So what he does is he brings back a sophisticated version of Ricardianism. We don't worry about market price, you worry about long-run cost. And of course, one of the two basic problems is, one is the long-run cost never arrives, so it can't be really the key thing. After all, the key thing is you want to explain the market, the real market, and not long-run whichever shows up. And secondly is that what do you do about goods that have no cost? Rembrandts, for example. Rembrandt painted the thing and then corked off. Okay, the price of Rembrandts fluctuates. Where is the supply cost? Where's the supply part of the blade? It ain't there, of course. There's only demand. They had to admit, well, it doesn't work for non-reproducible products. Well, after all, non-reproducible is important. That's part of pricing too. Isn't it better to have a price theory where we have a general explanation of all prices than one which only explains reproducible goods? And so that, of course, is not discussed. The non-reproducible, of course, goods were just tossed in the wastebasket along with consumption with Ricardo. All this is brought back, as I say, in a very sophisticated manner. And Marshall, having tremendous prestige as a Cambridge professor, dominates all of English economics from the 1880s until 1920s. And Jevons was sort of a maverick, semi-Austrian, so to speak, maverick. Doesn't get any hearing, and he dies young too. So that told against his influence. So what you have is a reestablishment of Ricardianism, and with Mill and Marshall being potentially in more sophisticated form. That is really, I think, that really ushers in the 20th century.